Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be kind of looking at some recent developments in international law and how they're impacting real people.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be taking a look at a really fascinating interview that was featured on ANC 247 with the Philippines Justice Undersecretary Raul Vasquez.
Okay.
And, you may already be familiar with the case of Mary Jane Veloso,
Uh-huh.
convicted of drug trafficking in Indonesia,
Right.
initially sentenced to death.
Yes, a very high-profile case.
Very high profile. But as you know, things have taken a pretty surprising turn.
Could have.
So this interview that we're going to be looking at gives us a glimpse into kind of the behind-the-scenes diplomacy and the legal back and forth that's led to this potential breakthrough in her case.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this.
Yeah, so to refresh everyone's memory, can you give us a little bit of background on Veloso's case and how she ended up on death row in Indonesia?
Sure. So Veloso was arrested entering Indonesia with a significant quantity of heroin. Hidden in her luggage, and Indonesia's legal system is notoriously strict when it comes to drug trafficking.
Right.
And so she was convicted and sentenced to death.
So it seemed like a pretty straightforward case at the time, given the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted the shift that we're seeing now?
Well, Veloso has always maintained that she was unaware of the drugs.
Okay.
She claims to be a victim of human trafficking,
Ah.
saying that she was tricked into carrying the luggage.
Wow.
And it seems that this claim, combined with the strong diplomatic ties between the Philippines and Indonesia,
Right.
has really paved the way for this different outcome.
It is surprising to me that Indonesia would agree to let Veloso serve her sentence in the Philippines.
Yeah.
How is that even legally possible? Especially when you consider that there's no formal treaty in place.
You've hit on what makes this case so unique. It really is what they call a sui generis situation.
Sui generis.
Yeah, which is a Latin term meaning of its own kind. There's no existing legal framework or extradition treaty that directly addresses this type of scenario.
So there's really no precedent for this.
Exactly. What we're seeing is the result of this really unique executive agreement between the two countries.
So just to clarify for our listeners, it's not a formal treaty that's been ratified by both countries' legislatures,
Right.
but a high-level agreement between the executive branches.
Exactly. And it has some pretty big implications.
Yeah.
Not only does it offer Veloso a chance to avoid the death penalty,
Right.
but it also sets a possible precedent for future cases involving citizens from either country. It raises all sorts of really interesting questions about international legal cooperation.
Yeah, so aside from the humanitarian aspect of this, this case could potentially chart new territory in international law.
Absolutely.
Is there any indication of when Veloso might actually return to the Philippines?
Well, according to Vasquez, the transfer could happen very soon,
Okay.
possibly even before Christmas. The Philippine embassy and Indonesian authorities are working out the logistics, but it's a complicated process.
I imagine it's not as simple as just booking her a seat on a commercial flight, is it?
No, not necessarily. Deportations usually happen on commercial flights.
Right.
But in this case, depending on security assessments and other factors, they might opt for a private plane
Okay.
or a more discreet arrangement.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So once she arrives in the Philippines, what's the plan?
The current plan is to transfer her to the Correctional Institute for Women,
Okay.
where she'll continue serving her sentence.
But there's also been talk about President Marcos Jr. granting her clemency.
Right.
Could she be pardoned and completely avoid prison?
That is a possibility. The power to grant clemency rests solely with the president.
Okay.
But Vasquez was very careful to emphasize that this decision is entirely at the president's discretion.
This brings me an interesting thought. If clemency is a possibility for Veloso,
Yeah.
what about other Filipino prisoners who might be equally deserving? Like elderly inmates or those with severe health issues.
Yeah.
Should the Justice Department be pushing for a broader review of those cases?
That's a good point. It raises a bigger question about justice and compassion.
Right.
Within the legal system, the president's power to grant clemency does extend to all prisoners.
Right, not just these high-profile cases.
Exactly. So maybe the Justice Department could recommend a list of individuals for the president to consider.
That would be a big step, recognizing that the need for clemency goes beyond these specific cases.
Absolutely.
Now, shifting gears a little, Vasquez also talked about the extradition of former Congressman Tevez from Timor-Leste.
Right?
Could you give us a little background on that case?
Sure. Tevez fled the Philippines while facing some very serious charges.
Got it.
He tried to seek asylum in Timor-Leste,
Uh-huh.
but his request was denied.
Wow.
And the courts there have approved his extradition back to the Philippines.
So just to be clear, he's not back in the Philippines yet.
Not yet, correct.
What's the current status of his case?
Well, the extradition has been approved,
Okay.
but there are still some legal processes that need to be completed. At the time of the interview, Tevez was under house arrest in Timor-Leste
Okay.
while waiting for the final stages of the extradition process.
It seems like the denial of his asylum request
Yeah,
and the approval of the extradition really point to a strong case against him.
absolutely. The fact that both Timor-Leste and the Philippines are cooperating in this way really speaks volumes about the strength of the evidence against Tevez.
So this case demonstrates that the Philippines is really committed to upholding the law,
Yeah,
even when it comes to high-profile individuals.
absolutely.
Now, before we move on, Vasquez also briefly touched upon the investigation into Vice President Sara Duterte
Right.
regarding a controversial video.
Yes.
Can you shed some light on that for us?
Sure, that situation is currently under investigation by the NBI.
Okay.
And if they find enough evidence, the case could be elevated to the National Prosecution Service.
Okay, so we have three pretty interesting developments here that we need to unpack further.
Definitely.
Veloso's imminent return, Tevez's pending extradition, and then this ongoing Duterte investigation. Each of these cases really offers a unique perspective on the complexities of international legal cooperation and how it impacts people's lives,
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected our world is, even in legal matters.
and how events in one part of the world can ripple out and have these huge effects
Yeah,
that go way beyond national borders.
absolutely.
So before we jump into each of these cases, what really stood out to you in this interview?
Well, to me, what's really fascinating is the unprecedented nature of this Veloso agreement. To see two countries navigate such a sensitive issue without a formal treaty, it's pretty remarkable. It really speaks to a level of collaboration that we don't often see in international relations.
That makes you wonder if this could be like a model for other countries that are dealing with similar situations.
Yeah.
You know, could we see more of these executive agreements kind of bridging the gaps in international law?
It's definitely possible. This case shows that even without those rigid treaties, there's room for flexibility and finding that common ground.
Okay.
Of course, it requires strong political will on both sides and
Yeah.
a commitment to finding those solutions that really consider, the complexities of each individual circumstance.
It also suggests that sometimes, like, sticking strictly to the letter of the law doesn't always line up with achieving actual justice
Right.
or showing compassion.
Exactly. That's a key takeaway from this interview, I think.
Yeah.
Beyond the legal processes and the technicalities, we're reminded that at the heart of these cases are real people
Right.
with real stories, and the stories often don't fit neatly into categories.
And in Veloso's case, her story has led to this, unexpected turn of events,
Yeah.
opening the door for a potential return and maybe even clemency.
It underscores the importance of hope even in seemingly impossible situations, and the power of international cooperation to really make a difference. Now, you mentioned earlier the Tevez extradition and how it highlights the strength of the Philippines' legal system.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little? What message does this send to the international community?
Well, it shows that the Philippines is committed to upholding the rule of law
Yeah.
and pursuing justice, regardless of someone's status or their political connections. The fact that a former congressman is being extradited
Right.
really emphasizes that no one is above the law.
It's a powerful message for sure. And I think it'll probably have implications for future interactions between the Philippines and its neighbors. When other countries see that commitment
Right.
to fair and transparent legal processes,
Right.
it builds trust and strengthens those diplomatic relationships.
It's almost like it's setting the stage for more agreements,
Yeah.
like the one we're seeing with Veloso.
Yeah.
Now, we can't ignore the political implications of these cases,
Of course.
especially with elections coming up.
Yeah.
These events are bound to be part of the public discussion.
Absolutely. These cases touch on really sensitive issues.
Right.
Drug trafficking, political corruption, the use of executive power. They're definitely going to be talking points during the elections.
How do you think these cases might sway voters?
Hmm.
Could they affect how people view the current administration
Yeah.
or specific candidates?
It's hard to say for certain,
Right.
but it's reasonable to assume that voters will take these cases into account when they're evaluating the candidates and their stances on things like justice, accountability, and international relations.
So it's not just about the legal outcomes,
Right.
but the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about the narratives and the messages that these cases send.
So voters are going to be looking at how these cases reflect on the government's integrity and effectiveness.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that legal matters and political realities are often intertwined, each one influencing the other.
We've covered a lot today. For our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, what are some key takeaways they should remember?
Okay, well, I'd say there are three main points. First, that agreement regarding Veloso's return was a really remarkable example of international collaboration. Second, the extradition of Teves. It shows the Philippines' dedication to upholding the rule of law. And third, that ongoing investigation into Vice President Duterte. It highlights that no one is exempt from the legal process.
Great summary. Now, what advice would you give our listeners as they try to make sense of these really complex and often emotionally charged issues?
Wow.
How can they stay informed without getting caught up in the political spin?
It's so important to be really careful about where you get your information from. Stick to credible sources, be aware of potential biases, and most importantly, think critically. Don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Question things, look for different perspectives, and then form your own informed opinions.
Great advice. It's easy to get swept up in the headlines and all the rhetoric.
It is.
But taking a step back and really thinking critically is essential.
Absolutely.
Especially during election season.
It really is. It empowers you to make informed decisions. And navigate this complex world of information and opinions. Now, while these cases demonstrate the Philippines' commitment to enforcing the law, the Veloso case in particular, it raises some interesting questions about balancing legal principles with humanitarian concerns.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a tricky balance, right? On the one hand, we have the rule of law, which is, essential for any functioning society. But then on the other hand, there's compassion and recognizing that sometimes individual circumstances require a more nuanced approach.
Exactly. And the Veloso case seems to be really pushing the boundaries of that discussion. It makes us ask, should there be more ways to incorporate humanitarian considerations into legal frameworks? Especially when we're talking about international cases and different legal systems.
It's a complicated issue with no easy answers.
It really is.
But these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, especially as the world becomes more interconnected.
Absolutely.
We need to figure out how to uphold the law while also recognizing the human element.
I completely agree. And this brings us back to that idea of critical thinking. As you follow these cases and others like them, it's crucial to look at all sides. The legal arguments, the political context, the human stories at the center of it all.
Don't just take the headlines at face value.
Exactly.
Dig deeper. Ask questions and come to your own conclusions.
That's what it means to be an informed and engaged citizen.
Couldn't agree more. So before we wrap up, is there one question you'd want our listeners to really think about as they continue to learn about these developments? What's that one thing that you just can't stop thinking about?
For me, it's this. How will these cases, especially the Veloso agreement, how will they influence future legal and diplomatic relations between the Philippines and its neighboring countries? Will we see a shift towards more collaboration, a greater willingness to consider individual circumstances? Or will these just be isolated exceptions?
That's a really interesting question. It shows how these individual stories can have a ripple effect and really shape international relations.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us as we explore these really complex and thought-provoking legal developments. Keep those minds engaged, folks, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.